what they think needs to be reported, and how they'd like to go about it. And then as managers, supporting them through that process by removing obstacles, giving them the time they need, helping them with the reporting, and allowing them to do what they do so well. Any thoughts on that, Jalyn?
I think it's interesting that I've been given one story from you in the 4.5 months I've been here. So I think that autonomy, is really important, because not only do I feel an ownership in my work, and I know that I've kind of birthed this little baby and let it grow and do its thing, but I know that it's important to me. And when your stories matter to you, I think that shows in how you tell your story. So when things are just given to you, you may not be connected to it. And that shows in your work. It shows in the people you talk to. It shows in how you shoot it. It shows in how you edit it. But when there's love and care, and I guess an interest, a pure interest in the story that you're telling, it benefits literally everyone involved in that process, as well as the people watching it or reading it.
And then going back to the importance of having a diverse staff and a diverse newsroom, as a hiring manager, and there's probably some who are in the audience, you never can stop recruiting. I mean, the thing I hear all the time and time again, well, there's just not we need a bigger pipeline. We need more journalists of color because it's so hard to find them. We absolutely do need a bigger pipeline. We absolutely need to encourage more journalists of color. But if you don't, it's laziness to say that there's not great journalists of color out there. There are. And if you say, oh, I tried, I put out an ad for 2 weeks, I wasn't able to find anybody, then you're not doing your job. Your job is to know those people, to get to know the community, to know, even if they're not ready for a new job, to develop relationships along the way so that when the time is right, you do have a diverse pool to call on for those open positions. And make yourselves available. Make yourselves as managers. Find the time to talk to young aspiring journalists, students, people who you want to encourage to eventually someday be part of your organization. It can't just start when it's time to hire and you put out that ad. Next slide, please. Let's go to the next one. So as I mentioned earlier, a big part of what we do at LX is context analysis, and beyond just the headlines of the day. We come at it from the premise that you pretty much know the headline by the time you get into our content, by the time you get into our newscast, because it's flashed 17 times on your cell phone from the 17 different sources that you have as apps. We want to go beyond what you think you know. We want to, we were joking the other day that when you read a newspaper article, usually the headline is in the first few graphs. And then when you get to graph 5, 6, or 7, that's where you really get the gist of it, of the context. The headline might be new killer virus is coming. And then by graph 5, you hear that, well, there was only one case of it in the last 12 years and it was involving a canine. And they're like, oh, fine, I'm good. So we try to get to those graphs head on the top. So we really try to explore, what this means for you and why it's important. And part of that is challenging assumptions. And that's challenging assumptions by all forms of information, from law enforcement, government, community groups. How do they know that to be true? How do they, when they say something, are we verifying it? And if it is true, is there enough context and nuance to really explain why it's true or why it's not true? Something can be true and still presented in a way that doesn't explore the true context of that statement. You absolutely have to recognize that systemic racism is pervasive in every aspect of our lives, and ask questions about it. Every story needs to looked at through that filter, as well as the other filters as journalism. If you're doing a story on a new bank opening, and they're celebrating how this great new branch is going to be great for the community, are you looking at where their other branches are? Are you looking at whether that there are communities in your market that are being underserved or not served at all by traditional banking? And then when you go to this event with this ribbon cutting, are you asking the CEO, well, this is great for this neighborhood, but why don't you have a single branch in these zip codes? And what are you going to do about it? That's a story that's rarely done that way. Usually it's a feel good, go out, celebrate the new branch, without asking the tough questions that need to be asked. So at LX, we really pride ourselves in not just giving the headline, the big picture, but giving the big picture. And then don't both sides it. There are fairness and objectivity is not the same as you have somebody to talk about systemic racism and then you feel the need to have someone to talk about that it's not such a thing. It is a thing. It's not the same as you have someone on climate change, then you need to feel the need to have somebody talk about, well, there is no climate change. That don't do that. You see that so often in especially in the world of cable news, and it does a detriment to your reporting and a detriment to your viewers. Jalyn, you want to get in on those two?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is digging deeper and really looking at the surface, I guess, of the story, but asking those harder questions that you really hit on, because everything affects different people differently. So in that bank example, okay, so we have a new bank, great. These people are getting a new way to save their money, whatever the case is. But let's look at potentially the construction workers who are involved. What's with the rigor of that? I guess that was not what I wanted to say, but I guess I'm just gonna endorse you. Dig deeper, love on those feel-good stories, but always ask, well, why do we feel the need to have a feel-good story? What's actually going on, or what are those things that you're trying to maybe not avoid, but not highlight, if you will?
Right. And I think I got your point. Was the people who built the bank probably some of them are from potentially marginalized communities. How much are they being paid? What are the working conditions? We just celebrate the emergence of these new structures, but we never really asked the process questions about how they came about, how they were selected, how the employees were treated along the way. And I think those are all important questions if you're looking to cover stories of how they impact your entire community and not just a narrow. We'll talk about this a little later, but I think it's worth saying now, racial and social justice and covering race is not a beat. It's not like, oh, okay, I'm going to do a race story today. Race is pervasive in all aspects of life, and every story has to be looked at through the filter of how it's impacting your entire community, not just the community that you're familiar with, not just the community that you grew up in, not just the community that you live in. I've had journalists that I've worked with who always pitch stories from their town. Oh, there's this great thing happening in my town. And that's not to say that we shouldn't cover stuff in their town, but that's a very narrow view of community. Community is beyond any given town or any given area. It's the entire, if you call it a community, it is an entire community. And stories should be looked at through that filter of how it's impacting that entire community and not just your vision of what you think your demographic is. And Jalyn made an excellent point early on, worth reiterating, that it's really important to include diverse sources and guests in your stories, and not just the ones about race. It's not, you're doing a story on border, you don't have to, it doesn't just have to be the time when you bring the Latinx or the Hispanic or Latino or Latina on. You can use diverse guests for stories that are not necessarily traditionally related to those stories. We have done a really great job at expanding our Rolodex so that it isn't the traditional people that we tend to go to. Jalyn said earlier, it's when you're on time crunch, you often go to the white guy who is the doctor from the local hospital. If you do a little homework, you'll realize there are a lot of accomplished people of all backgrounds, of all ethnicities, and build that Rolodex. So you're not just going to the same people over again. Not to say you can't include those people, but don't just include those people. There's a great resource if you don't know of it. NPR has a diverse sources database where they've already done some due diligence and collected a variety of experts in a variety of topics with contact information. It's training.npr.org/sources. It's a great way to start if you want to try to expand that Rolodex. But I also encourage you just to do some informational visits to some of the institutions, organizations within your community, and talk to the people who are the gatekeepers and say, hey, you always give us the same person every time we call for a cardiologist or every time we call for a finance person. I'd like to talk about some of the other people that work here and how we can get them involved with our reporting and being our experts. Next slide, please. I think Dr. Clark made it so abundantly clear that language matters. And as journalists and storytellers, language is our tool of how we do our job. And so it's really important how we tell those stories. One of the things that we do at LX, and I think it's a growing trend, which I think is welcome, is letting sources self-identify. I've talked to some journalists who would say to me, well, I'm frustrated. I don't know what terms I'm supposed to use. Are they supposed to say Black or African American? And I say, well, ask your subjects how they prefer to be identified. Subjects should be allowed to self-identify. And even if you're using different descriptions in the same story, that's fine. It's because they're deciding how they want to be identified, not you. And that is an easy way for you not to have to worry about whether you're going to get it right or wrong. Simply asking someone, how would you like to be identified? Jalyn, you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think I'm not sure, I wasn't able to attend the earlier portion of this, but one thing I think is that emphasis on self-identify and never being afraid to ask people what they want. Because at the end of the day, if you're going in to tell a story, even if you're trying to help it, you can hurt it unintentionally by mispronouncing someone's name or by misgendering them. There are easy ways to kind of offend people. So by making an initiative, or I guess a purpose to put their opinions and their, I guess, self-identity up first can help you in a lot of ways. Because if you're not in that specific community, you need to recognize that you're not an expert in that regard. And that goes for me as well. You have to really let those people in that community guide that conversation and say, hey, I heard X, Y, and Z. I heard people being called this. What do you think? What do you prefer? What do you like? Really putting it on them, because at the end of the day, it's their story being told, not yours. So you have to make sure that they feel adequately and properly represented.
Right, and recognize that there's no monolithic group. So we did a story recently looking back at Hurricane Katrina, and one of the people we interviewed referred to himself as a climate refugee. We use that term for describing the other person in the story who took great offense to that, who said, I'm not a refugee in my own country. I don't want to be called a refugee. I don't want to be described that way. It wasn't intentional. We thought, that was okay. But had we asked, is this a term that you're comfortable with? Would you describe yourself as that? We would have known that she preferred to be described as something different. It would have been simple as just making sure we asked. And then I think it's really important to consult, not that the AP Style Guide isn't important, but they're not the end all be all of how we describe and how we use descriptions. We have a racial justice news coverage here at NBC Universal that we are consistently upgrading and updating, which takes into account changing trends, how things change. Terms that were once acceptable are no longer. And even if we don't intend to do that maliciously, terms that we used to use can be offensive, can be maybe not to the person using it, but the people who it's directed at. So we always have to continue to evolve and continue to look at how we use language, what that language means, and how it impacts all of our community. There's also a Global Press Journalist Style Guide I recommend checking out. They've done a nice job at creating their own alternative to the AP Style Guide, asking some of those tough questions. Is this the best term to use? Is this how people in that community prefer? But again, remember that there's no one term that always works. You're going to have to do your homework and you're going to have to ask those questions. Next slide, please. This is just a couple screenshots from our covering racial style guide. We look at things like how we cover crime. Do we need, for a long time, everybody used a mugshot whenever it was made available without thinking about the harm that could do to the person who's in the mugshot. Taking for the word of it that law enforcement was right. We'd get the press release, we get the mugshot, we'd write our story from the press release, we'd put up the mugshot, and we'd say, okay, story done. Well, we now know that a lot of those press releases are not accurate. Some of them are very much not accurate. George Floyd's press release described him as dying from a medical condition. Had there not been that video, who knows whether or not that would have been the narrative that held. That case in itself should be enough for us to give us pause that anytime we get a press release or statement, we should ask more questions. And so we have a guide that talks about the things you should and shouldn't do, things you should ask. And I encourage newsrooms to start developing their own racial and social justice guides as well. Next slide, please. More information about sourcing. We've talked a lot about that today. The importance of finding different sources, importance of questioning sources that we traditionally treated as fact, and asking questions no matter who it is that is providing the information. Next slide, please. And then we have a diversity style guide A to Z that we continually update. We try to help our journalists understand the terms that people prefer to use, terms that might have once been used that are now found offensive. And again, it's something that you can't just do once and be done with. It's something that you constantly have to look at, reevaluate, and get a lot of feedback from. It really requires a buy-in from everybody to provide their point of view and perspectives. Next slide, please. I think this is really important, and it's largely not spoken about in newsrooms. A little bit better since the pandemic, but that's mostly been geared towards people struggling from the pandemic. It's rarely looked at in terms of racial trauma. It's really important that you recognize that there is a great deal of trauma in covering these stories about racial and social justice, especially for the journalists of color in your newsroom. It's a tough situation to have to both cover it and deal with the pain and the trauma of seeing a video of a Black man being killed over and over again. And so it's important to create a space where people are taken care of, where are given the services and support they need, and are given a safe environment to talk about it, even if it's a tough conversation. We ask, it's funny, as journalists, we expect people to answer tough questions. We ask tough questions of the powers that be, but we're not so comfortable asking tough questions of ourselves and within our own newsrooms. Our standard should be the same whether we're asking the governor a tough question or we're asking ourselves tough questions. We need to be able to have those conversations about how we cover race, about how we're taking care of our journalists of color, and about how we're doing our job when it comes to these issues. Jalyn?
And it also goes to how we share our stories with our viewers. So we recently did a George Floyd anniversary special, for lack of a better term. And at the beginning, our host, Ashley Holt, she decided that we weren't going to use any video of George Floyd's murder or any video of the shooting of Dante Wright. So that was something that they decided well early on that they did not want to show because of that trauma that is associated with it. So that was on behalf of the journalists who were continually editing and making that special, but also the people watching at home, just kind of being, I guess, attentive, or rather respectful is the best word I can think of right now, and what people want to see. Because of that, I've avoided watching any of the videos in full, in totality. I haven't watched a video of anyone in a while for my sanity. And there are a lot of people who feel the same way. So just be conscientious of that and recognize that not everyone wants to see everything. And be open and upfront and honest with that. Here's why we're not showing it. Here's why we're just going to show you X, Y, and Z, because we want to make sure that you at home or us in the newsroom, whatever the case is, we want to be conscientious of what you're kind of intaking, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And let your staff be their authentic selves and respect their narratives. I think that's getting better. It's better than it was, but it's still, there's work to be done. And if you're a manager or a news director, the only question you should ask about one of your employees' hair is nothing. It's not your business. There's no such thing as good hair. I mean, that was said for so long. You heard news directors tell journalists of color, "Oh, you're going to have to straighten this. You have to." That was inappropriate then. It's very inappropriate now. It's this notion, and it's part of I would guess if you were to ask a lot of them whether they even recognize that is a form of systemic racism, they would go, "No, I just think the audience wants that, or that's what the consultant said." That is not an appropriate question. Never was. Never. It won't be. And then this is something I think is really important, because I think Jalyn probably experienced this being in the newsrooms were mostly homogeneous white. But I've had some white journalists say to me, I don't understand why our colleagues don't want to educate us, tell us how to deal with all this, especially after George Floyd. And I think it's important to remind yourself and to remind your colleagues that it's not journalists of color's job to educate the white staff on racism and privilege. If they want to do that, absolutely. But they shouldn't be expected to do that. Nor should they be the go-to people in the newsroom for anything race-related. That's not their job either. I think about how much trauma it has been. Jalyn just said how traumatic it is to see those images, to living through these times. Now you're asking them to actually do the work for you. Okay, yeah. Oh, wow. I didn't realize how bad it's been. Will you tell me how I can be a better ally, better advocate? So you're now putting that responsibility on someone who's already been traumatized by the images and years and years and years of systemic racism. Go do your research, do your homework, talk to the people within your newsroom whose job it is to do diversity, inclusion, and equity. Most of them have them now. They've taken on that job because that's something they want to do. But don't make the assumption because as a journalist of color that they're there as your resource and you can just tap into that whenever you want. You want to talk about that, Jalyn, a little bit?
Yeah, I guess earlier this year, someone asked me what it was like being colored right now. It was a loaded question for a variety of reasons. But I was like, well, what do you mean? She's like, well, what's it like? How are you experiencing things? Like, what should I do better? And it was really interesting because it was a very earnest question. I can tell there was no malice behind it, but if she Googled even what is colored, she would have recognized that that's not a term to call people of color anymore. So it's really just about taking things into your own hands, because at the end of the day, everyone has resources for the most part in terms of Googling and finding out, or asking people at the very least, hey, why is this an issue? Why Do we think this way? Why does this happen this way? So it's not my job, quite frankly. Does it bother me to answer questions? No, not me personally. But I know a lot of people who get upset physically and upset when it's like, why don't you understand what I'm saying? Why don't you just see that I am struggling enough, and me trying to be there for you is too much for me. So really just being cognizant of how much weight is on people's shoulders. And this is for any topic as well, but just kind of really realize where you stand and how a simple question can really affect someone's mental health, for sure.
Absolutely. Next slide, please. Okay, just a couple of closing thoughts. I think we covered some of these already. I think an important part of covering these topics, and all journalism, quite frankly, is to incorporate solutions journalism. In the research we've done and the research others have done, our audience really wants to know how things can get better, not just laying out the problem. It doesn't mean you have to be partisan. We're not talking about making voting recommendations, but we're talking about who they can go to if they want change. What organization or agency is responsible for that? What are ways of which they can get more involved? What are solutions for how these things can change? Laying out a problem is great, but audiences really want to know, now what? And I think that really is particularly true in talking about racial and social justice. And we've talked about this, how race isn't a beat. It's got to be part of every story, every day, every question. And it's your responsibility as journalists to be advocating for your entire community, not just your town, city, or the place you grew up in. We also talked a little bit about the importance for needing a bigger pipeline, which is true, but that's not an excuse to stop recruiting and working and recruiting currently within your organization. And then this is just a closing thought for me, and then I'll turn it over to Jalyn. I think it's really important to be respectful that everyone processes grief and pain and anger differently. If you have a diverse newsroom, which you need to, you have to recognize that they're not going to handle some of this stuff the way you handle it. And you have to be respectful of that. And you have to give people the opportunity to process in the way that they need to process. I see a lot of institutions and organizations have a one-size-fits-all for how they deal with things, from sick days, personal leave. And I don't know if that necessarily works anymore. There may be times when you as a manager have to recognize that certain people in your newsroom are struggling, and giving them the time and the resources they need to deal with that. Because otherwise, if you pretend like everybody is dealing with it the same way, you're kind of missing the point of this whole exercise to begin with. Jalyn, what are you closing thoughts?
I think a last thing I want to say is that you don't necessarily have to be in a community to tell a story about it. I think that's something that we think about, and kind of what you were referencing earlier, Matthew. It's like, well, Jalyn's a Black reporter. Let's send her to this Black event. Let's send her to this Black story. It doesn't have to always be that way, but even though you're not a part of the community, you do have to be aware of what's going on in that community and be aware of the different nuances happening within it. Because at the end of the day, no one has to share their community story with you. They need to be able to trust you. They need to be able to respect you and who you are, and know that you're coming from a place of love and genuine interest and support. And if you can't provide that to people, most times they're going to shut down. So you're not entitled to anyone's story, even though we're journalists, even though we're ready to share all this information with people. We're not entitled to anything. So you have to be aware of that and respect people's boundaries. And even if your story is thrown off because of it, it's okay. Because at the end of the day, you recognize, like, hey, this is me going into someone else's space. Let me kind of adjust, adapt, and keep it moving.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jalyn. And I don't here to suggest that this is the only way to do these things. I think LX, we've been working hard to try to do things better than has been done in the past. There are other ways to do some of these things. I think we're making great progress. We always have work to do. I don't think there'll ever be a point where we will get to the end and say we're done. We're always going to have to be aware of these issues, always have to try to work better, always try to be more inclusive, more equitable, more just. It's going to be an ongoing process, and it's something that we have to commit to. And whether it's working for us, I think we just celebrated our 1-year birthday, and I just got some viewer data that's not even put out yet, so don't tell anybody. But we just found out that nearly 70% of our viewers are people of color. Which is much higher than most television networks, broadcast networks that are not necessarily specifically for a particular audience. And I don't think that's a coincidence. I don't think that we've been able to have a more diverse audience is a coincidence. I think it's because we've been putting together the kind of journalism that appeals to a broad part of our community. And I think it's resonating. And I hope that continues to be the case. And I hope that there are lessons we share today that you can take back to your news organizations and try there. And both Jalyn and I are always available for questions and always happy to talk more. And I thank you for including us today. And I appreciate you all joining and attending because this is important stuff.
Thank you all so very much.
I think you're muted.
Common Zoom problem. And I've been zipping back